Life is constantly changing, and a lot of times we don't even like where God is leading us through these changes. But today we're going to learn a valuable lesson from a woman in the Bible named Naomi, who lost her husband and both of her sons in very tragic fashion. And yet, God had a purpose beyond anything she could have imagined. So join us today for When Life Takes a Turn for the Worse. Today, we're going to talk about something that I think we all need to hear. And I think it all comes down to life is just life. And sometimes it just takes a turn for the worse. So we're going to talk about that today with a woman by the name of Naomi. We're working through a series called Been There, Done That. And the reason why we're doing this is because we want to learn from the people in the Bible. People who have done really good things and we're like, yes, I want to emulate that. Or if they did really bad things, we're like, yeah, I need to not do that. So that's kind of why we decided to do this series. So today I want to talk about life and how we should respond when it changes. Because we need to know this. I realize that whenever we do these series, there seems to be a theme that goes through all of these lessons. And I was looking back at a couple weeks ago lesson and I realized that I kind of said the same thing. And it's this: life is constantly changing. I realized this when we went to California this year. We stay at this place where if you want to get to the beach, you have to go down these stairs. It's like down, turn, down, turn, down. Okay, I counted them one time. I don't remember how many stairs they were. Here's a picture of it so you can see going down is no problem. Going back up is like a disaster. It's it's just like horrible. So anyway, what happens is I go down, walk on the beach, I come back up, I walk up halfway stairs, and then I'm like dying because I can't breathe. And so I turn around and I pretend like I'm looking at the ocean, but I'm actually just trying to catch my breath. That's kind of how that works. So I get to the top of the stairs, and there is this elderly woman, and she's up there with a surfboard. And I was like so impressed. I was like, oh my gosh. I go, did you surf? And she goes, yes, I did. She said, my problem is that I got cancer. I've had ovarian cancer for the last couple of years. And she said, but I'm really just trying really, really hard to just get back on my surfboard. So she said, I take my surfboard out into the ocean and I sit on it. And she said, I just kind of am trying to get my body acclimated back to that. Now, in my mind, for those of you that know me, this is where my mind went. Yeah, a shark. All I could think about is this woman has been spending 2 years, and I'm hoping that a shark doesn't come up and think she's like a seal and then eat her, and that would be, so anyway, I was thinking about this as we were talking, and then I had to be like, okay, you need to refocus, Lisa. But I turned around and saw somebody else coming up those horrible stairs, and it was an elderly man, and he had a surfboard on top of his head, and she goes, oh, that's my husband. And I was like, oh my gosh, I am so proud of you guys. I said, this is really, really impressive that you would actually do this. I didn't want to say at your age, but I kind of meant that. But the funniest part about that is, as I left, I was thinking, I say elderly, but maybe I'm her age. I don't know. That throws that whole maybe I'm elderly. I don't even know anymore. But anyway, she said this. She said, you should have seen us 20 years ago. You should have seen us surf 20 years ago. And I got home and I told Rob about this couple. And I said, Rob, it's just this really great reminder that as life changes, we need to really be okay with the place that God has us. Because it dawned on me, for this couple that surfed, they never thought there would be a day when they wouldn't be able to surf. They probably never thought there would be a day when she would have cancer and they couldn't surf. You just kind of don't think those things as you're growing up. I know we talked about this book that Rob and I were supposed to write this summer, which of course we didn't because I couldn't get motivated to do it. But I think I've read you the preface of this before, but I'm going to read it again because it kind of goes into what our lesson is about today. It says this, I wrote this, the day it etched in my memory The day is etched in my memory. Rob and I at the time were raising 5 children. We're in our 20s and 30s and had busy lives with work and soccer practice and dance recitals, so when I saw it, I was shocked. I remember looking in the mirror in my car, and there it was, a wrinkle on my face, a deep line that at the time I seemed way too young to have. Sounds funny that something as silly as that would leave a lasting impression. I can't seem to recall what I had for lunch yesterday, but that moment of finding a wrinkle is still lodged in my brain. The reason that makes me laugh is because there's something inside of us that thinks growing older and getting wrinkles is for someone else. We assume we will always look like we did with the day we graduated from high school. We look at people we knew 40 years ago and are surprised at how they don't remotely resemble what they used to. But us? Like in that mirror, we can't imagine that we've changed as much as them. But apparently we have. And the problem is that nobody really warned us that that would happen. And nobody really prepared us for what was coming. Which brings us to today's lesson, which is this. Things change in life all the time. People get wrinkles, people get sick, people get, divorced. Like, there's just things change in our life. But a lot of times the things that change, we are just absolutely not happy about it at all. And so you and I are always going to have this choice, the choice that says, as a follower of Jesus, I know God is doing something. Or I can be bitter and angry and upset because I don't like the way my life is going. So today we want to talk about a woman. Her name is Naomi, because her life changed drastically, but she had a very, very negative, angry spirit about her. And it was all because her life did not turn out the way she really thought that it should. Her life was filled with lots of trials, lots of disappointments, tragedy, hurt. And please understand me when I say this. I am not minimizing that at all. I know she had a really, really tough life. And you'll see that through the story today. But what we can look at the end of her story is that God really, really had a plan. And he used her and all the bad that she went through. And I always say, this is another theme for this whole series, in his grand sweeping story. Here's my thing. Here's why. She could not possibly have seen it at the time. See, God is doing something in our life, but at the moment, we can't see it. And my hope for today is that if you're here and your life is filled with trials and hurts and disappointments, that we can walk away and handle it differently than Naomi did. That we can always keep Jesus in the forefront. That we can have joy in the midst of trials. And that we can actually let God use whatever bad is going on for good. And this will sound really weird, but I think it all comes down, our attitude comes down to really understanding what it means to follow Jesus. And we talk about that a lot here too, because it's not just saying a prayer and just like, yeah, I just was baptized and everything's fine. It really is, following Jesus is about surrendering your life to him. And what that means is this. We say, God, I will go wherever you send me, no matter what the cost. God, I will go through anything you ask me, no matter what pain I have to endure. Because if where I am sent, or for anything that I have to go through, if people come to Jesus because of how they see me respond to that, or you respond, then here's the deal. Then I'm all in. I'm all in. Because that's what we see in the Bible. Like, we see this all the time. And we're going to say this over and over today. This is what we know. That God is constantly weaving your story into his story. And we say, well, what is his story? His story is a story of redemption. It's a story of Jesus. It's a story of you and I being separated from God, and Jesus coming to take our sins, to make us available so we can have a relationship with him, and we can spend eternity in heaven with him. That's his story. So, when you decide to follow Jesus, he's going to use you to be a part of that story, his story. See, we're not getting that. People aren't telling you that that's really what it means to be a follower of Jesus, but that really actually is what it means to follow him. And all we have to do is look through the Bible to see that, you know what? We're never, ever promised that we're going to have an easy life. We're just not. When you decide to follow Christ, there's nowhere in the Bible that says you're going to have this pain-free, trial-free, I always say non-sucky life. In fact, it kind of says the opposite. Think of all the people we've just studied in the past 6 weeks. Noah, Elijah, David, Abraham, Moses, Caleb. They all had tragedy and heartache and persecution and problems. And the reason why is because their stories are about real life. Nothing about these men ever screams, oh, I had an easy life. All we have to do is see Jesus hanging on a cross after being, tortured and crucified and all of that, to realize that sometimes a story needs pain in order to bring about good. And no matter what pain we have to go through, God wants to use that to point others to this overarching story of redemption. So here's what we're going to learn today. Our life is like this, and I'll show you 2 different pictures. This is a tapestry. It's hard when the picture's blown up. It doesn't come out really that great, but you kind of get the picture. In order to have this beautiful picture tapestry on the front, by the way, this comes from mylifeisbutatapestry.com. I guess people do these things for a living, which is kind of cool. I found this and I loved it. The reason why I loved it is because this is the front side. This is the picture that it's supposed to look like. But here's what it looks like on the back. That's the back side. And we need to realize that in order to get that beautiful picture, that's what our life is going to look like on the back. And as we talk about Naomi today, we're going to see that her life eventually becomes this, but in order to get here, she has to go through a lot of that. And I think it's the same for you and I. Now, the problem with Naomi is this. We'll tell you this right up front. She missed out on the joy that could have been hers had she just recognized that her story was a part of God's story. Had she recognized that no matter what happened in her life, that she was just part of God's overarching plan, then I think she could have been joyful about the whole thing. Someone once said, as a follower of Jesus, as someone who really trusts God with their life, here's what you know: they can have deep sorrow for loss and yet true joy because they know God has a purpose. There's a really big difference between how you and I, as followers of Christ, handle the things in our life versus someone who doesn't know him. And hopefully, after learning her story today, we can say, amidst whatever trial we're going through, this: I can only see the jumble of yarn. I cannot see the final picture. But that's okay, because I trust that God will do something wonderful with what I only see as chaos. So let's meet our leading lady, Naomi. We find Naomi in the book of Ruth. Ruth is definitely about, Ruth and Boaz, but I think there's this bigger lesson that we learn, and I think we learn that from Naomi. So let's walk through her story. Ruth 1 verse 1 says this: Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. Now, I need to remind you this really quick. If my hair is blowing, I told you this, I think a couple lessons ago, it's because there's a fan here, all right? Because it's really hot in here. So I always tell people that, we're not trying to, do some kind of weird effects. It's just really hot in here. So just so you know that. That's my famine. It's just hot. All right, there's a famine in this land. Now, the story, that we're talking about is at the time of Judges in the Bible. This was after the Israelites, they're led into the promised land. They're supposed to follow God. They're supposed to, be a representative of his to the other nations. But instead, they forgot him. Instead, they joined into the worship of all the false gods, and they started living immoral lifestyles with the people of these wicked, the wicked people surrounding them, pagan people, and in the surrounding nations. And so what would happen is that they would all walk away from God, and so then God would, respond with judgment. And a lot of times it was, an enemy coming in and starting a war with them. Sometimes it was just famine. And that's what was going on when we meet this family. Here we go. A certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, I put a map up here because I want you to see this, because this is a map we talk about all the time. If you've been to Bible study, you've seen this. When they get into the land, of course, we know there's 12. This is called the 12 tribes of Israel, and it just means Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob has 12 sons. Each one of those sons gets a portion of this land. That's how it looks like here. The man we're talking about here was from Judah. If you could look at the very, very bottom down there, you'll see Judah. Right above where it says Judah, it's Bethlehem. So a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, that's why it says that, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, here's some interesting facts about Moab. If you look on that map, you'll see it all the way over to the right. So you see Judah, you see the Dead Sea, and then you see Reuben. Right below Reuben, you see Moab. But there's no color because Moab was not a part of the Promised Land. It was not a part of Israel. This is a weird fact, and I don't even know why I'm sharing this with you, but it'll kind of give you an idea of the people that inhabited this area and why it was not a part of Israel. For those of you that remember the story of Lot with Sodom and Gomorrah and that whole disaster, so Lot with his two daughters, because his wife's turned to a pillar of salt, so they run to the mountains because of course everything's just with Sodom and Gomorrah just like blowing up by. But the girls didn't think they would ever meet a man. So I know, gross, but they got their dad drunk and then they slept with him and they both got pregnant. Okay, so this is like one of those stories in the Old Testament that was just like, ugh. But anyway, Lot's oldest daughter had a son. His name was Moab. And that's where the Moabites descended from, that little area right there. Moab was actually a very hated enemy throughout the whole Old Testament. So that kind of gives you an idea of this. But verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. The names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Now to me it seems really, really odd. Like, why would they do this? Like, why in the world would this good Jewish family flee to a place where they didn't even know the one true God? So they're literally walking into enemy territory. And I get that they didn't have food, but I always think that's like me saying, we don't have food in the United States, so I think I'm going to fly to Iran and live there. It's kind of the same thing. Like, who would do that? Like, I don't think we would. But even if Moab had food and Israel didn't, why wouldn't they just trust God? Like, why wouldn't they just go, God, we don't have any food, but I'm going to trust you to provide it for me. But I think there's a lesson to be learned from going into places where we shouldn't go. Here's what we want to learn from this. When there is trouble, don't run to enemy territory. It's easy to do. When your Christian boyfriend breaks off, your engagement, don't run to the bars and start dating unbelievers in enemy territory. When you lose a loved one and you're just so mad at God for taking this person away from you, don't give up on your faith and run into enemy territory where nobody believes in God. When you get fired from, let's say, working at the church, then don't get a job down there at the strip club in enemy territory. Because that's what happens so often in life. It's so much easier just to walk away from God than to just stay and dig in and seek him more and grow closer to him. And that's exactly what Elimelech should have done. He shouldn't have taken his family to an enemy territory. But for whatever reason he did, and we know ultimately God was in that decision. So Elimelech decides to take his family and go here away from the protection of God's people into this foreign land. Verse 3, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And she's left with her two sons. Then something else bad happens, that if you're a Jewish mom, you're going to get this. Verse 4, now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Her two boys that she wanted to find good Jewish women for now are in a pagan country, and her two Jewish boys have now married two foreign women. You just don't do that. And her heart had to have been broken. Here's what we need to remember. When we go places we know we shouldn't go and do things we know we shouldn't do, there's really always consequences to our actions. But then it gets worse. Then both Mahlon and Chilion, her boys, also died. So the woman survived her two sons and her husband. So here is Naomi. She left Bethlehem with her husband and their two sons. She's stuck in a foreign land. Husband died, both sons died, and she's stuck there with her two foreign daughter-in-laws. And honestly, if I were Naomi, I don't think I'd be very happy about that either. Everything in Naomi's life has been shattered. I bet her heart was in a million pieces with the loss of her husband and both of her sons. And I always say, I wonder if all of this would have happened had they just stayed where they should have stayed? I don't know. But I do know this, for those of you that have run into enemy territory, here's what I know. God can redeem our time in enemy territory. See, this is really, really important. Maybe for some of you today is the first day that you turned this on and you found this Bible study and you're like, you know what? I need to leave enemy territory and get back to God. And for you, maybe you were the one who had the affair and blew up your family, or you were the one that went back to drinking, or you're the one who went back to doing drugs, or you're the one who walked away from God. But maybe today is the day you, like Naomi, knows, I got to go home. I have to come back to God. And I want you to know I'm really, really proud of you if that's you. Because when you do, here's what you need to know. You have a God who is waiting for you with open arms. God has always been trying to protect you. But for so many of us, we think he's just so mad at us and he's out to get me and he's going to, take a hammer and hit me over the head. Like, that's just not true. Several years ago, a paper reported this story. One evening, a woman was driving home when she noticed this huge truck behind her that was driving really, really uncomfortably close. She stepped onto the gas and she tried to gain some distance, but no matter how fast she went, this truck just stuck right with her. The woman turned onto Main Street, hoping to lose the pursuer, but the truck ran a red light just to stay near her. Reaching to the point of panic, the woman whipped her car into a service station, jumped out of her car, and started screaming for help. The truck driver jumped out of his truck and ran towards the car. Yanking the back door open, the driver pulled out a man hidden in the back seat. The woman was running from the wrong person. From his high vantage point, the truck driver had spotted this would-be rapist in the woman's car. The chase was not in an effort to harm her, but it was in an effort to save her at the cost of even his own safety. See, that's what God's plan is for us. It's a plan for good and not evil. He wants to rescue us. He wants to rescue us from the hidden sins that endanger our lives. And always know this, he can always, always redeem whatever you did wrong. As we're going to see this with Naomi, her time in Moab was like the back of the tapestry that looks disastrous, but God can still make a beautiful picture from it. We can see that's her life, but this is what God can do with it. We never want to forget that. Verse 6, then she arose with her daughter-in-laws that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughter-in-laws with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughter-in-laws, go return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. In other words, girls, I need you to go home. Like, it's been really nice getting to know you and all of that, but I need you to go back to Moab. Now, this is where I tell my favorite joke of all times. If you listen a lot, you get to hear this about twice a year because it's super funny. But I only get to tell it when mother-in-laws show up, and so this is one place. So this is because I think how Ruth responded to her mother-in-law, Naomi, is not really normal. Like, this is normal. George goes on a vacation to Israel with his wife and his mother-in-law. During their vacation, George's mother-in-law died while they were in Jerusalem. With the death certificate in hand, George went to the American consulate to make arrangements to send his mother-in-law's body back to the United States. But the consul told him, he said, it's going to cost you way too much money. It's like $5,000 to do that, but we can bury your mother-in-law here in Jerusalem for $150. And George thought about it. And he's like, yeah, no matter how much it costs, I'm sending her back to the United States. And he said, wow, you must have really loved your mother-in-law to spend that kind of money between, $150 to $5,000. And he goes, no, it's not really that. He said, I just remember there was a case many years ago where a man was buried here in Jerusalem and he came back from the dead 3 days later. He says, I just don't want to take that chance. I don't know why I love that joke. It's super funny. But that just sounds like a normal mother-in-law scenario. And you wonder why Naomi was so adamant about the girls going back to their own home. That doesn't even make any sense, but maybe, think about this. She's been gone for a lot of years. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram showing wedding pictures of her sons getting married. And so maybe Naomi would be embarrassed to bring these two foreign girls back to Jerusalem because doing what her sons did by marrying these were in a direct violation of God's commands. And maybe in a weird sense, she's like, how am I going to explain these girls to all my Jewish friends? I don't know. Girls, just go on back. Verse 9, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept, and they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. And Naomi's like, no, really, we're good. No, we want to come back with you. No, really, we're good. Verse 11, but Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them until they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? In other words, I can't have any more sons for you girls, so you need to go back to Moab and find somebody who can take care of you. And then Naomi says something that I think most of us feel like when our life takes a turn for the worst. She said, no, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Now, I want you to stop and think about that for a minute, because she leaves Bethlehem with her husband. She went to a land filled with Israel's enemies. She didn't trust God to provide food for her. Now, in Naomi's defense, it could have been because of her husband. Maybe he's the one who forced this on her and said, no, we have to do this, and she just followed him and whatever. But if that's the case, she should have blamed her husband. She should never have blamed God. But when our life takes a turn for the worse, it's so easy to blame God for everything. Well, I'm acting this way because God let my husband leave me. I'm acting this way because God won't let my doctor give me the right medicine. I'm acting this way because God wouldn't let, that person hire me. And it's just this weird thing. We just want to blame God for everything, and it's so self-focused instead. We self-focus instead of God-focus. As followers of Jesus, we need to look at our life differently. Here's what we need to do. We can be sad and joyful at the same time. And as we work through Naomi's life, we need to learn that we really can. You can be sad and joyful. Sad because you're hurting, and I get that. But joyful because we know this, that God is constantly weaving your story into his story. Post that on your refrigerator. Never, ever forget that. In 2002, Lisa Beamer was interviewed by a writer for Today's Christian Woman after her husband Todd Beamer died during Flight 93 during the terrorist attack of 9/11. She was asked, what happened to you on 9/11? She said this, as soon as I heard that it had been her husband's flight, she said, I cried out no and crumpled to the floor. I spent the rest of the day in my bedroom, huddled on my bed. I felt as though I literally needed to hold every atom of my body together, otherwise I'd fall apart. She said that later family and friends and church people came to be with her. And she said this, I didn't break down crying hysterically or scream. God already was giving me incredible peace. What she had that I think Naomi didn't, with the loss of her husband and her kids and everything, is just that community around her. It's that community that comes alongside of you and says, look, I'm going to be here and help you get through that. Naomi didn't have that. When Lisa was asked, what is your biggest struggle now? This is how she answered it. She said, it is living in grief and in hope, which are both realities. When anxiety creeps in, I tell myself I'm not going to let that happen because it won't do any good. I can say, poor me, and get swallowed up by pity. Or I can say, I am blessed. See, we all have those choices in life. She said, we learned this from the account that Lisa had a choice to either accept or complain about the providential will of God for her life, and she chose to accept it. And I think that's a really good lesson for us. That you can be sad, but you can be joyful, because when you know God is doing something, it just it gives you more peace than someone who doesn't know that. Verse 14, and they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her about it. Here's the cool thing. God had big plans for Ruth that Naomi did not know about. God had big plans for Ruth. And what I want to remind you is God has big plans for you. Even though you may not even understand what God is doing at the moment, he really still does. Look at how involved that God was in this whole situation. Regarding Ruth, think about this. She would have felt way more comfortable going back to Moab. Why wouldn't she? That's her home, her people, her false god. And yet God somehow changed Ruth's heart and gave her this overwhelming desire to go to Bethlehem with Naomi, to a strange land, to worship a God that she didn't even know. See, people just don't do that. But when God is involved, he moves people where he needs them to go. So Ruth and Naomi head to Bethlehem. And this is where we see Naomi's really bitter, really bad attitude. Verse 19, now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? People were so excited, like, oh my gosh, it's like going to your 10-year reunion or something. Naomi's back. Let's go welcome her. Let's see how she's doing. But instead, we see something. Women. And we've all been there. So this is kind of as women, we need to get a grip on this. Is this Naomi? You can just hear them. Gossip. Whisper. Gossip. Whisper. Look at her. Look at what she's wearing. Wow, she needs Botox. Wow, 10 years, 15, however long it's been. Doesn't look very good on her. And see, that's what people do when someone comes back from enemy territory. And this is just a reminder that if you know someone that's walked away from God for a time and then has come back, you know what? I think they need our love, and I think they need our support, and they need us to be their friends, to be there for them. They don't need us to gossip about them. We do that in our day and age. Wow, Betty looks so skinny. And then you add on probably the drugs, and then you roll your eyes so that people know, what you're really saying. Wow, Linda's wearing ragged clothes. She must not have money from drinking her life away, and then they roll their eyes. You see how that works? We're like, can we stop? People are hurting, and we don't need to judge them, and they don't need to feel judged. They need us to be so excited that they're back. We should be the ones that are taking them out to lunch, and what can I do to help you through this time? We should be the most loving, kind, and generous, which I don't think that's what was going on with the women, the Jewish women who just saw Naomi. She needed people who would help her. She needed people to come alongside of her that would help her remember that God still has a purpose for her life, even though it feels like her life just blew up. So they start calling out her name, Naomi, Naomi. Look at verse 20. And she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Like, really? She goes on, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? She missed out on the joy that could have been hers, had she just recognized that her story was a part of God's story. But she didn't. And with this statement, we see that we know she clearly believes in God, or she never would have even blamed him. But her bitterness spilled over to everyone that came in contact with her. So I was thinking, what did people see with Naomi? Did they see a woman filled with joy amidst the pain? Did they see a woman who just knew God so well, that knew that he could use, tragedy for good? Did they see a woman pointing people to her God because she trusted him no matter what? I don't think so. Kay Arthur reminds us of this in her book, The Refiner's Fire. She went to an election night party one night because a Christian man that she knew was a congressional candidate. He seemed like he had a really good chance of winning, but as the votes came in, they knew that he would not win. And it was weird, and this is a side note, but he kind of felt like God called him to run. Like, he really felt that way. He felt like this is something God wanted him to do. I was thinking about that with the last election with all the Republican candidates, and you had like Mike Huckabee. And, Mike Huckabee always wanted, he felt so called by God, to be, president. But sometimes, and we have to remember this, in the sovereignty of God, sometimes God says no, and we need to be okay with that. So during this whole party that Kay Arthur was at, there was this woman at the party, and she was in Kay's Sunday school class. And the woman at the party began lashing out at everyone, the media, the people, yelling, screaming. She was so angry. You didn't give him a fair chance, and this is just not right. And she makes a scene. So Kay goes up to her and says this, I understand, but you and I know that God is sovereign, and we don't know why God did not allow him to get elected. But by you acting this way, you are hurting this man's cause, but even more importantly, you're hurting the cause of Jesus. In other words, people are watching. And how we respond to things in life tells us, it shows ourselves, but it also shows other people around us. Do we really trust God? Or are they just words that we say, little Christian cliches? Because here's what we know is life can turn sideways at any moment. And our goal in life is to build our faith so strong, to know God so well that we can, here you go, show people our God even amidst really tragic things. Kay writes this, pain and tragedy are the proving grounds of our belief in this. So often you hear people say, I was fine with God until he let this happen. But when tragedy strikes people, they cry, no, God, no, and then they walk away from him because they wrongly thought of him only as a cosmic Santa Claus. But other people going through the same kind of tragedy come through stronger than ever and more faithful than ever because they cling to the sovereignty of God. She gives an illustration on Interstate 35 in North Texas on a rainy July morning. A proud grandfather was driving his 4 precious grandchildren back from a family vacation that they had. But it started raining. Their car hydroplaned out of control, crossed the median, slammed into another car, and the grandfather and 4 children were all killed immediately. The mother of those 4 children, she had 5 children, but that was 4 of them, she just lost her 4 children and her father. But she had built her faith really strong. And she understood the sovereignty of God really well. And the children's obituaries in the Dallas Morning News reflected this. This is what it said. This family is so grateful to have had this blessing from God, even for a fleeting time. Who can say that? The Derby family looks forward to being together in eternity with the Master and Shepherd. I don't know why that just touches my heart, because most people are so angry with God, but when you really have that strong faith, you're just kind of going, God, I don't know why you did this, but I really trust that you have a purpose. The thing they knew is that people knew that they were followers of Christ. They knew that they were serious followers of Jesus. So the people looking at them, what were they going to see? Were they going to see a family just torn apart and angry and mad at God and walking away from him? But they didn't. I think the family cried and mourned for a very long time. But because their faith was built on this solid rock, they just exuded this belief in a loving God and trusted that he had a reason for this horrible tragedy. And that's a really tough story. And in reality, most of us will never, ever face anything like that. We may never even face the death of someone that we love, but we might have a death of a marriage, or a death of a job, or a death of a friendship. So someone doesn't have to actually have an actual death to still feel the sting of loss. But if you feel that way, how will you respond to those around you? Because here is some hope. I want to give you hope that no matter what you're going through, always remember that God is constantly weaving your story into his story. And you need to know this. This side of heaven, you may not see the whole picture. This side of heaven, I don't even know why God does half the things he does. I really honestly don't. Just that story alone, God, why would you take 4 children? Why would you do that? I don't know. I just don't know a lot. But Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 13:12, now we see things imperfectly like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. And see, I think when we get that, when we really get that, we can walk through this life with our faith intact. And we can do that without ever having to know why. Instead, we can trust that God knows why because we're confident he's weaving a beautiful story. And I think we really can be confident. But here's what I know. In order to do that, you have to grow your faith muscle. See, if I were wanting to get physically stronger, if I wanted to do this, that takes a lot of work and effort. And I really don't want to do that. This is why I decided not to exercise this little gift right here. But here's what we know. To be a swimmer, to be a bodybuilder, or dance instructors, you actually have to work at it and build up those muscles. And the same is true with our faith. That's why we always tell people you need to read the Bible, read stories like Naomi, like all of these people that we've been talking about over the last 6 weeks. Because the more time we spend getting to know God, the more time we face things in our life that we're like, I don't know what to do. Oh, maybe I'll trust God with that. The more we do that, the more our faith muscle grows. But it didn't seem like Naomi had been trying to build her faith muscle the entire time she was gone. Because here's what I think. She knew about God, but she didn't seem to know how to trust him. Verse 22, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, now when they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Now think about this. When Naomi left, there's a famine, there's no food, there's no hope. But when she comes back, it's the beginning of barley harvest season, which is always around March or April. It's the beginning of Passover, and it's this time of great celebration. But remember, since Naomi didn't have a husband or sons, and she didn't have a job, or she didn't have money, she didn't have any man to take care of her, she didn't know how to get food, but then she probably remembered something. That when this barley harvest season, when they were working in the fields, they would always have leftovers. It was something that the law of Moses actually put in Leviticus. It says, if someone is working in the fields, they need to leave grains of stock or grapes, as they're going by, leave some. And then there would always be the poor or the widows or the people who couldn't handle or didn't have food. They could come along behind them and pick that up so that they would have food. It was kind of awesome for that. So Naomi might have come home knowing that at least that they could, fall into that widow category and get food that way. Now, that was just chapter 1. But chapters 2 through 4, we suddenly begin to see the hand of God in this whole big situation with Naomi's life and Ruth's life. And we're going to start to see this big picture of the death of why God allowed this death of Naomi's husband and her 2 boys. And it's a great reminder once again that God really does know what he's doing, even at the time it makes no sense to us. Half the time in our life it's like, I don't know what God is doing. But it's a great reminder that God is big enough. And he moves different people to different places. And it's a great reminder that God changes the minds of people, just like he did for Ruth going with Naomi to Jerusalem. We were watching a TV show the other night on, I think it was on the Hallmark Channel. It's called When Calls the Heart. And we watched it all summer long, 5 seasons into it, and suddenly, spoiler alert for those of you that are watching it, one of the main characters, dies off. And Rob's like, what? What the heck? Why would they do that? So we Googled it. Why would he do that? Well, he decides just to not renew his contract. And we're thinking, why would someone ever give up a lucrative contract like that? But something changed his heart, and something changed his mind and made him restless. And so he worked on another project, and that's actually where he met his future wife. But I don't know anything about him spiritually, so I wouldn't even say that was a God thing. But as a follower of Jesus, we can be confident that when God changes our heart or it's God's doing. Because we have the Holy Spirit living with us, inside of us, which is God. And so he's going to move us to places we need to go. Mark 1:12 shows us this. The Spirit then compelled Jesus to go to the wilderness. 8:14, Romans 8:14, for all who are led by the Spirit are children of God. Acts 8:29, the Holy Spirit said to Philip, hey, go over and walk along beside the carriage. See, the Holy Spirit has a big part in our life, moving us and leading us and guiding us to different places. And this small little book of Ruth is this great reminder that there is this big picture, even though it has this yucky stuff on the back. That's how it's going to feel most of the time. Ruth 2, verse 1. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. Now enters a man, Boaz, who just happens to be a relative of Naomi's husband who died. And that actually is a really, really important piece of the story that we'll get to in a second. Verse 2, one day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest field to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." Now, maybe they were hungry, maybe they needed food, I have no idea. But verse 3 says this, "So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech." As it happened, oh, what a coincidence. Ruth ended up in one of the fields of the one man that could help them both. And we know that's not a coincidence. We know that that's just the hand of God. But from there, this story becomes a love story. Boaz sees Ruth. He protects her. He makes sure that she always has food. Verse 19 says, "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asks. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz." "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. This man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers." Now, this is why this is important, because what a redeemer did back in this particular time is that when a man died and he left a widow, if there was no son to pass their land on to, then let's say the brother or the uncle or the cousin or whoever was the closest, he was able to get the land. The land would go to him, but if he chose to take on the land, then he would have to take on the widow and whoever. So in this particular case, you always go, well, the land is free, and then you go, well, sort of. But but whoever gets the land now has to take care of the widow or their children or whoever was left. So when Naomi hears the name Boaz, she realizes that this is someone that can redeem the land that she and her husband had lived on. So Naomi begins to have hope. Now, I'm going to sing a little song that, of course, nobody's going to know unless you're my age. So most of you will not even remember this. But when we were like in second grade, we used to sing little stupid songs like this, like Boaz and Ruth sitting in a tree, Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in a baby carriage. Okay, that's what we used to sing. But I think that's probably what Naomi was thinking, like, wait a minute. We can get these two together. This might be a really good thing. And so that's where her mind was going. But eventually the harvest is over, and Boaz has not made any kind of romantic move on Ruth at all. But he was really kind to her. But the problem was he probably was a lot older than her. If he was a relative of Elimelech, her father-in-law, then that means Boaz was probably 30-ish years older than her. So let's just say she's 30 and then he's 60, or however that plays out. So there's this big age gap. So he probably never even thought that she would be interested in him. So Naomi decides to push Ruth a little bit, like, hey, send him a text. Like, invite him out to dinner. Or, sign up for the, Boaz dating site. But we know since they didn't do that back then, Naomi tells Ruth to do something that I think is really creepy, okay? So this whole scene just throws me. Look at this, Ruth 3. One day, Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, it's time that I found a permanent home for you so that you will be provided for. Boaz is a close relative of ours, and he's been very kind by letting you gather grain with his young women. Tonight he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. Now do as I tell you, take a bath, put on perfume, and dress in your nicest clothes. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz see you until he has finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down, then go and uncover his feet and lie down there, and he'll tell you what to do." "I will do everything you say," Ruth replied. So she went down to the threshing floor that night and followed the instructions of her mother-in-law. After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down at the end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. Okay, now, every time I read that, I think, wow, I'm glad he didn't have a gun, okay, because he probably would have been terrified and shocked, and he might have just grabbed the gun and shot her. Like, I don't know. That's 4,000 years later, however many years it's been. We were laughing one time at church. The pastor was doing a sermon on this exact thing, and Cheyenne was sitting there, and during the middle of the sermon, she looks over and she goes, "Mom, look at that really cute guy over there in the next row or whatever." And I said, "Hey, the Bible says, why don't you just get up and go over and lay at his feet in the middle of the church service?" And, of course, she just rolls her eyes because she thinks I'm a total nutcase. Anyway, verse 9 says this, "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer." She basically tells him in a roundabout way that she wants to marry him. And it's so awesome to hear his response. Because honestly, this could have gone really bad. He could have looked at her and laughed. "I would never marry a Moabite foreign woman." He could have said, "Guards, throw this woman out." He could have said, "Oh, that's so cute, sweet little girl, but you're like a daughter to me." And see, it's weird. She was really honestly putting herself out there to be hurt. Verse 10, look what his response is. "The Lord bless you, my daughter. You're showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Now don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what's necessary, for everyone in town knows you're a virtuous woman. But while it's true that I am one of your family redeemers, there's another man who is more closely related to you than I am." In other words, maybe Boaz was the cousin and maybe Elimelech had a brother, and it kind of goes in line like that. And so he knew he had to let the other guy have the chance to redeem this property first. He said, "Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him. If he's willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he's not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you myself. Now lie down here until morning." So the next morning, Boaz goes into town. The other guy just happens to be there, which I always think is kind of cute. Because God always, we've said this before, always makes sure he's big enough to make sure the right people are at the right places at the right time. It reminded me of a story I heard a long time ago. There was a girl, and she thought her husband was having an affair. Like, she was very, very convinced of it. We'll call her Carla. Carla thinks her husband's having an affair. But she could not prove it. And she just did not, she couldn't prove that he was actually doing this. So her friend Mary is on an airplane going somewhere, and unbeknownst to her, 2 rows in front, she sees her best friend Carla's husband with this other woman laughing, kissing, carrying on, blah, blah, blah. And you go, what are the odds that Mary is on the exact same flight that Carla's husband was on with his girlfriend? See, and it's like, because that's how big God is. Like, God can do things like that and weave his way into doing whatever he needs to have done. And that's what was going on here. So back to Boaz, he tells this relative about Naomi. She's back in town. He says, "Hey, you're the redeemer first. You can take the land." And the guy's like this, "Perfect, I'll take it." And I bet Boaz felt very, very heartbroken. But then he explains to him the whole situation. Verse 3, "And Boaz said to the family redeemer, 'You know Naomi who came back from Moab? Well, she's selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should speak to you about it so that you can redeem it if you wish. If you want the land, then buy it here in the presence of these witnesses. But if you don't want it, let me know right away, because I am next in line to redeem it after you.' The man replies, 'All right, I'll redeem it.' Then Boaz says, 'Well, of course, your purchase of the land from Naomi also requires that you marry Ruth, the Moabite widow. That way, she can have children who will carry on her husband's name and keep the land in the family.' And with that, the man realizes that, oh my gosh, I have to take on another wife. And he's probably envisioning his wife, hearing this, and he's like, yeah, my wife would kill me. I'm not doing that. And so he gives up all the rights and he says, Boaz, she's yours. And I think Boaz was thrilled. So fast forward everything to end the story. They get married. Ruth gets pregnant. She has a little boy named Obed. And if that was the end of the story, it wouldn't even be that big of a deal. But there's so much more, and look at it. Matthew 1, this is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. And it goes through, like, these genealogies. We're like, oh, they're so boring, I pass them over. But don't pass this one over. Look at this. Verse 2, Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Salmon was the father of who? Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. That in itself is a whole amazing story. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. And verse 16, Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Mary gave birth to Jesus, who was called the Messiah. Here is Naomi, who had this horrible, horrible, tragic life filled with just sadness and heartache. But all along, God had a plan that included her daughter-in-law, which is why her sons had to die and her her husband had to die, because God needed this woman to be a part of the lineage of Jesus. But for any of that to happen, Naomi's life would have to change. And that's the point to our lesson today. When your life changes, always remember you're part of God's story. Which means you and I can handle these changes differently than Naomi did. She always had the choice in her life to look up, to trust God, to believe that He really was in the midst of this, good or bad. She had a choice to be joyful and to point others, but she didn't, and it's a really, really important lesson for us. You and I are a part of God's story. So the next time something happens in your life that you are about ready to fall apart about, you need to stop and remember this lesson and remember Naomi and say, wait a minute, I can face this with joy because I know God is doing something. See, you and I can live completely different than Naomi did. She missed out so much on life because of her negativity. I want to stop here and actually end here, but I want to just do this really quick and show you why this is important. When you see this basketball here, this basketball in my hands actually is worth about, let's say, $19. If you took this basketball and you put this in Michael Jordan's hands, it's worth probably about $33 million. Here's why. Whoop. It depends. See if I can say that right. It depends on whose hands it's in. If I had this baseball right here, this baseball in my hand, it's worth, I don't know, $3, $4 maybe. But if you put this baseball in the hands of Mark McGuire, it's going to be worth about $19 million. Because of that, it depends on whose hands it's in. If I keep this rod in my hand, all it is just, a way for me to walk and not fall. Although I was laughing this morning because I walked out to go outside, and right on our outside window screen was a tarantula. Like, it was this monster tarantula. And Rob was outside, and he'd walked outside and didn't even see it. About scared him to death. But in my hand, this thing would kill a tarantula. Okay, that's kind of where I went with that this morning. But a rod like this in Moses' hand would part a mighty sea. Because it all depends on whose hands it's in. Look at this little thing, our little slingshot. A slingshot in my hand is just a kid's toy. It means nothing. A slingshot in David's hand is a mighty weapon to take down a giant. See, if I had nails, I could produce a birdhouse. Nails in the hands of Jesus produce salvation for the entire world. I guess that's where I want to end today, is that it all depends on whose hands it's in. And see, when we become a follower of Jesus, we put our life in the hands of God. And that's what I want. You can put your concerns and your worries and your fears and your family and your kids and your dreams and your relationships in God's hands. Because we can trust and know that He will take care of it. Because I don't want to keep those things in my own hand. That doesn't mean anything. But when I put all of those things in the hands of God, it really depends on whose hands it's in. And I want to put my life in His hands and trust no matter what happens, that it's all going to turn out the way God wants it to turn out. So when you feel like your life kind of sucks, I want us to learn from Naomi, because she has been there and she's done that. And she knows that God has bigger plans. And it's just a reminder that he knows exactly what's going on in your life, even if there's pain involved, and even though we don't even understand it at the time. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this lesson. God, I just pray for every person that's going through something today, that they just don't know what's going on in their life, and their life has taken a change, a turn for the worse. And God, I pray that today's lesson, they'll be able to face things with joy and peace, because they know that ultimately you know exactly what you're doing in their life. I pray for that for each person in Jesus' name. Amen.